Hello and welcome. I am Exit Light and this is my channel. Today I am going to tell you about a case in which 5 young men found themselves on a mountain in the middle of the night. 4 of those men were eventually found dead. 1 was never found. This case is sometimes referred to as the American version of the Dyatlov Pass incident. For those of you that do not know, the Dyatlov Pass incident is a case where 9 hikers were mysteriously and strangely found dead on the Ural Mountains in what we now know as Russia. That case was named after the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. In this case, it is sometimes referred to as the Mathias group, named after one of the 5 young men, Gary Dale Mathias. So, please sit back and listen to this tale, and let's go. February 24th, 1978 will forever be known as the night that the 5 boys went missing. They were called the boys and our boys by their family and friends, even though they were all grown men ranging in ages between 24 and 32 years old. However, they all lived at home. Their names were Gary Dale Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jackie Hewitt, Theodore Ted Weir, and William Sterling. 3 of the boys have been given the general diagnosis that they used back then as mentally retarded. They were slow. 1, Jack Madruga, hadn't received the diagnosis but was generally considered slow in his mental development, and another, Gary Mathias, was under treatment for schizophrenia and psychotic depression. The night of the 24th has been described as there being a half of a moon in a cloudless winter sky. Up in the mountains above the Feather River, the snowdrifts were rising as high as 15 feet. All the boys played basketball for the Yuba City Vocational Rehabilitation Center for the Handicapped, and they were expected to play in a tournament on February 25th. If they won, their team would receive a free trip for a week to Los Angeles, and the boys were very excited. Mathias's mother recalls that he was driving her nuts about the game. He kept telling her, "We got a big game Saturday," and insisting that she not let him oversleep. Ted Weir requested that his new white high tops be washed after he scuffed them trying them out. They all had their clothes laid out on the 24th with their beige t-shirts that read Gateway Gators across their chests. Ted Weir was employed for a while as a janitor and a snack bar clerk, but he quit at the urging of his family. They thought that Weir's slowness was causing some problems. Jackie Hewitt had a slight droop to the head, and he was sometimes slow to respond. But he was a loving shadow to Weir, who looked after Hewitt in a protective sort of a way and would even dial the phone for him when Hewitt had to make a phone call. Jack Madruga was a high school graduate and an Army veteran. He had been laid off in November of 1977 from his job as a busboy for Sunsweet Growers. William Sterling was Madruga's special friend. Deeply religious, they would spend hours at the library reading literature so that they could help bring Jesus to patients in mental hospitals. Gary Mathias was an assistant in his stepfather's gardening business and also an Army veteran. He had a psychiatric discharge after drug problems that started while he was in Germany 5 years before. Mathias took medications for the treatment of schizophrenia, and police records had showed that he had twice become violent and was charged with assault after his return from Germany. However, he had been taking his medicine and hadn't had any problems of the sort for quite some time. The last exchange between Ted Weir and his grandmother, with whom he lived, was when Ted was leaving to attend a college basketball game. As he walked out the door, his grandmother called out to him, "You need a coat." Ted replied, "Oh, Grandma, I won't need a coat. Not tonight." And she watched him walk away for the very last time. On that Friday, February 24th, they drove about 50 miles north from Yuba to Chico to attend that basketball game. 2 hours before midnight, when the basketball game ended at the California State University at Chico, the 5 young men, the boys, from the flatlands 50 miles to the south, climbed into a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego and drove out of the parking lot. The boys were happy. They were fans of the visiting team, and they had won. After they left the parking lot, they stopped 3 blocks away at Bears Market. They slightly irritated the clerk who was trying to close up shop. The boys purchased 1 Hostess cherry pie, 1 Langendorf lemon pie, 1 Snickers bar, 1 Marathon bar, 2 Pepsis, and 1.5 quarts of milk. Then they walked out of the store. They got back in their car. They drove south out of Chico and into the darkness of night and disappeared, never getting to play their own tournament on the 25th. Strangely, but not unlike a loving grandmother, Ted Weir's grandma woke up afraid at 5 o'clock the next morning. She could not say what had woke her up, except that maybe the Lord decided it was time to end her one last night of solid sleep. She found that Ted's bed was empty. The house was still, and it was not quite light, and this is how the horror began, as it often does. Without warning, without any notice, just a gnawing quietness on a day that should have otherwise been just like any other day. Imogen Weir got on the phone and called Bill Sterling's mother as fast as she could. Juanita Sterling was already awake, and she had been since 2 a.m. Bill didn't come home either, she said. Mrs. Sterling had already called Jack Madruga's mother. Jack also had not come home. Mrs. Weir called Jackie Hewitt's mother, and Mrs. Weir's daughter-in-law walked down the street to talk to Gary Mathias' stepfather. All 5 had vanished. The boys were gone. Because this had never happened before with the boys, by 8 p.m., Mrs. Madruga had called the police. Saturday came and went, and no word came. So, the county sheriff's department began to search for the men. On Tuesday, February 28th, they found Madruga's Mercury. And, from that day on, nothing they found and nothing anyone told them seemed to make any sense. It was a forest ranger that found Jack Madruga's car abandoned. The car was on an unpaved road near Oroville, in the Rogers Cow Camp area, past Elk Retreat, at an elevation of 4,500 feet. The turquoise and white car was found 70 miles away from Chico, and in the opposite direction from the route that the boys would have been expected to take if they were driving home, and way up in the mountains in the Plumas National Forest. They had driven on a deserted and rut-ravaged mountain road. They had stopped at a snow line, and although their tires had spun a little bit, the car was not really stuck. 5 men could have easily pushed it free. The gas tank was a quarter full. There were 4 maps, including one of California, that were folded neatly in the glove compartment. The front and back seats were littered with the wrappers of the food that the boys had bought at Bears. Everything had been eaten except for the Marathon bar, which was half gone. The keys were missing, but when police hotwired the car, the engine started immediately. Police found no evidence of foul play at the side of the car, which was unlocked and had one window rolled down. After inspecting the car, which had no dents and no gouges, the undercarriage with a low-hanging muffler was in perfect condition, even though the road it had traveled on was violently marked with deep potholes. Police determined that whomever had driven the car was either a master driver or knew the road very well. It was common knowledge between the families that it was Madruga who only ever drove that car. And the families say that Madruga, who disliked camping and hated the cold, did not know that road. Once, about 8 years earlier, Bill Sterling had gone fishing with his father at a cabin not far away, but he had not enjoyed himself and had stayed home the few times that his family had ever gone back. 3 previous years before, Weir had hunted deer with friends in the Feather River country, but it was quite a way west of the area where the car was found, and his family says that he did not like being in the forest. In fact, with the exception of Mathias, who occasionally stayed out all night with friends, each of the boys were adamantly more comfortable staying at home with a very scheduled predictability. Therefore, no one could fathom what or who might have taken them up that lonely road in the mountains that night. Forest rangers searched the area for 5 days and found no trace of the men. But soon after the search began, a severe blizzard moved into the area, covering any potential tracks. Around 9 inches of snow dropped on the upper mountain. The search teams nearly lost men themselves 2 days later, as their snowmobiles struggled to get through the drifts. Then, something even more strange happened. When the police received a call from a man named Joseph Shones. He had heard about the missing boys and called to tell the officers that he'd seen them somewhere between 11 and 12 on the Friday night they went missing. He told them an incredible tale. According to Shones, he was driving up the gravel road to his cabin when his car became stuck in the snow, and unfortunately, while trying to push his car out, he suffered a heart attack. The story from there is a little confusing. In one version, while he was laying in his car at about 11:30, he saw 2 sets of headlights coming up behind him. One was a car, and the other was a pickup truck. He said he got out of his car to flag them down, and the 2 vehicles stopped about 20 feet from him. In a second, more strange and mysterious version, while inside the car, he heard a whistling noise and saw what he thought was a group of men with a woman and a baby walking in the light of another vehicle's headlights. Shones called for help, and the lights turned off, and the whistling stopped. He said that a few hours later, he saw flashlight beams outside his car and called out for help again, but the lights immediately turned off. Shones stayed in his car until it ran out of gas. Then he walked 8 miles down to get help, passing Madruga's car on the way. He said he didn't think much about what he'd seen until he heard about the disappearances. Naturally, the police weren't sure what to think about either of his stories. After that, a woman reported seeing the 5 men in a red pickup truck on Saturday and Sunday, about an hour's drive from the site of their abandoned car. She owned a store there, where 2 of the men came to buy food. One of the men, she said, made a phone call from a nearby phone booth, and the other 2 stayed in the truck. Then, there was nothing. No sightings, no word of the boys for months. What seemed like an eternity, really. It must have just felt as though those boys had just walked off or had been taken off the face of the earth. There had been nothing, not even a sock, to show for the boys until in June, a man riding his motorcycle with a group through the area noticed a broken window on a Forest Service trailer. The trailer was located about 19 miles up the mountain from where the car was found. Now, on this trail, there had been a snowcat who had gone this direction a day or two before the men had abandoned their car. So some think that perhaps the men had followed the trail, thinking that there would be safety at the end of it. But even then, imagine a 19-mile hike without proper equipment in heavy snow. The group with the motorcycles wandered into the trailer and were immediately struck by a nauseating smell. They had inadvertently stumbled upon the body of Ted Weir. He was stretched out on a bed inside the main 60-foot trailer, and he was frozen to death. 8 sheets had been pulled over his body and tucked around his head, suggesting that he hadn't been alone in that trailer, as he would have been unable to do that himself. His leather shoes were off and missing. On a table by his bed, there was a nickel ring with Ted engraved on it. There was his gold necklace, there was his wallet with cash inside, and there was one strange item. A gold Waltham watch. It didn't belong to Ted. In fact, it didn't belong to any of the boys. All the families confirmed that this watch didn't belong to the group of the 5 men. Search and rescue teams then began combing the area around the trailer. The day after Ted's body was discovered, searchers found the remains of Madruga and Sterling. They lay on opposite sides of the road to the trailer, 11.4 miles from the car. It's been suggested that hiking up the trail, they had been overcome by hypothermia and passed away, and were left by the other boys. Madruga had been partially eaten by animals and dragged about 10 feet to a stream. He was laying face up. His right hand was curled around his watch. Sterling was in a wooded area, and his body was scattered over about 50 feet. There was nothing left of him but bones. 2 days later, just off the same road but much closer to the trailer, Jackie Hewitt's father found his son's backbone along with a pair of Levi's and his shoes. An assistant sheriff from the Plumas County found a skull the next day, about 100 yards downhill from the rest of the bones, which the family dentist used to identify his remains. Hewitt's remains were located northeast of the trailer, like Sterling's and Madruga's. Northwest of the trailer, about a quarter of a mile away, searchers found 3 wool Forest Service blankets and a 2-cell flashlight lying by the side of the road. The flashlight was slightly rusted and had been turned off. It was impossible to tell just how long it had been there. They found no sign of Gary Mathias. His tennis shoes were inside the Forest Service trailer, which suggested to investigators that he might have taken them off to put on Weir's leather shoes, particularly since Weir had bigger feet and Mathias's feet might have swollen with frostbite. Although the men's bodies were heavily decomposed, autopsy results determined that they had likely died from exposure. Well, 4 of them anyway. Weir had been a tall, heavy-set fellow back in February. He was 5 feet 11 inches and about 200 pounds. By the time his body was found, he had lost between 80 and 100 pounds. His feet were badly frostbitten. The growth of beard on his face showed that he had lived for anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks from the day he left that car, and had apparently starved to death, weighing an emaciated 120 pounds. Weir, who'd been wearing a striped velour shirt, lightweight green pants, had either walked or ran with the boys, or been taken somehow in the cold darkness of night through almost 20 miles of 4 to 6 foot snowdrifts to reach that locked trailer where he died. This story then takes an even stranger turn. The trailer, which had been broken into through a window, had on its floor matches, paperback novels, playing cards, and wood furniture that would have easily been burned. Yet there had been no apparent attempt to start a fire, despite the freezing temperatures on the mountain. There was a propane tank connected to the trailer, which could have provided a ready source of heat and cooking fuel, and it was untouched. All they had to do was turn that gas on, said Yuba County Lieutenant Lance Ayers, and they'd have been able to have gas to the trailer and heat. But even more disturbing than that, in a storage shed outside, there was a year's supply of sea rations. Those are individual canned, pre-cooked, and prepared meals issued to the U.S. military. The men had consumed 36 of the meals, but left the majority of them untouched. In addition, there was a huge supply of freeze-dried meals. One of the sea ration cans had been opened with the Army P-38 can opener, which only Madruga and only Mathias, who had served in the Army, would probably know how to use. But no one had opened a locker in the same shed that contained enough dehydrated Mexican dinners and fruit cocktails and assorted other meals to keep all 5 alive for a year. All through the spring, the search for the boys had practically consumed Lieutenant Ayers. He had gone to Marysville High School with Weir and his brother, and although he didn't know them very well, there was just something about this silent disappearance of the 5 men, the boys, that haunted Ayers. By late spring, Ayers was dreaming about the boys at night. One night he woke in the darkness with his arm outstretched. He had almost embraced all 5. Ayers was quoted as saying, "You do a lot of handshaking and a lot of drinking." State mental institutions were given a description of Mathias: slender, dark-haired, double vision without his glasses. He was not carrying his billfold when he left the house for the Chico basketball game, so he had no identification on him. And he didn't have the amount of medication he would need to last for 4 months. His stepfather was quoted as saying, "What I looked for all the time I was up there in the mountains were his glasses. I didn't think a bear would eat that." There are so many questions that remain, along with the shattered hearts of the boys' families. Why would the boys abandon a perfectly good car in perfect working condition with plenty of gas? Why did they go in the opposite direction of their home in the first place? How did they get down a road that would have been next to impossible to drive on unless you were used to the road and could anticipate every deep rut, and without any damage to the car? What were the whistling noises and voices Shones claimed to heard on the road? There was some force that made him go up there, Jack Madruga's mother, Mabel, says firmly. they would have fled off into the woods like a bunch of quail. We know good and well that somebody made them do it. We can't visualize someone getting the upper hand on those 5 men, but we know it must have been. Ted's sister-in-law claimed they seen something at the game, at the parking lot. They might have seen it and didn't even realize they seen it. I can't understand why Gary would have been that scared, said his stepfather. Even a fire, he said. All those paperbacks, and they didn't even build a lousy fire. I can't understand why they didn't do that, unless they were afraid. They can't imagine what the boys were afraid of, but also can't imagine what happened to them and why it would have happened unless they were afraid. Why did Ted Weir apparently starve to death with all that food so close? Was the group abducted? Was food being rationed out to him or refused to him for some reason? Whose watch was in the cabin if it didn't belong to the boys? No one knows if Gary is dead, but they think he is. They think his body probably lay on the snow until the spring thaw came and eased him down deep inside some thick green patch of mountain manzanita. If that is the case, hopefully someday his body will be able to be laid to rest in peace, even if no one else will ever be quite the same or feel quite the same amount of peace they felt before the horror began, before the boys didn't come home. Thank you for coming to my channel. If you're not already subscribed, please do. And please click that thumbs up. It really helps my channel. And if you'd like to be notified the second I upload new content, please click that bell.